Good evening to everyone. Very thankful to see everyone that's able to be here for our midweek service. I hope that what we have to study for a little while this evening will be helpful for all of us. As I've done several times on Wednesday nights over the past, it's been a year or two, I guess, since I started this. I thought we'd continue the series that I've been engaged in of doing some overviews of each book of the Bible. And we find ourselves now at the book of 1 Kings. We haven't gone over this too much, but I thought it'd be a good time to just kind of review where we've come from. Not a long review. I don't have time to do a long review, but just kind of calling to mind again and reminding of kind of the timeline and the time structure, the eras, you might say, of Bible history. I remember learning these as a very young child, and they always helped me kind of be able to place the order of events in the Old Testament, and then later when you get to some of the other books, we'll be able to place where they happen. But what we've covered so far is we've gone from the book of Genesis through the book of 2 Samuel. Of course, we covered the era of creation as well as the patriarch era, all there in the book of Genesis. The books of Exodus through Deuteronomy take us through what we might call the Exodus period. That's the departure of Israel from their bondage in Egypt as Moses leads them. Of course, then there's the failure by the nation, and so they wander the wilderness for 40 years. But we learn about their exit from Egypt, the giving of the law and their wanderings, and then the final Deuteronomy is kind of the second telling of the law to the new generation. Then we have the era of the conquest that's told for us in the book of Joshua, the era of the judges, that very dark period after the grandly successful time period of Joshua and the people that lived during Joshua's reign, followed, of course, by the time period of the Judges, when the book of Judges tells us multiple times that there was no king in Israel, but everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so there were a lot of evil things that happened, a lot of sin and rebellion. The nation would suffer. They would be imprisoned, or they'd be beholden to some other power until God would raise up a judge after the nation repented or the people repented. And so there were judges that would be military victors and leaders like Samson and Gideon and the other judges that we read about. Now, while it was a dark period, of course, the book of Ruth fits in there as well. And so there was that bright spot in the midst of that dark era. And then we come to the books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel that we've covered most recently, that transition out of the era of the judges. There's Samuel, who was essentially the last judge. And then as he becomes older, the people don't want his sons to be judges over them, and so they demand a king. And he's upset by that, but God tells him to do that. And the first king, of course, is King Saul. And that transitions from the period of the judges to the period of the monarchy, or to the kingdom era. And that's going to last throughout the book of 2 Chronicles. So the rest of 2 Samuel, and then the books of Kings that we'll talk about, and the books of Chronicles cover that kingdom era. So that's just a brief recap of the history that we've covered so far in going over the Bible, the books of the Bible. And so now we come to the book of Kings. This is going to pick up right at the very end of David's reign. If you'll remember, 1 Samuel told us about Samuel and Saul and David before David became king. And then 2 Samuel was all about David's kingship. And then we come to the book of Kings. Now, one thing about the book of Kings, this is just for those that enjoy this type of information, we have 1 Kings and 2 Kings. When you go back to the original Hebrew Bible, you had many of these books that we have 1 and 2 of were actually just one book. For example, Samuel was just one book in the original Hebrew. Now, in the Septuagint, that's a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. It had 1st and 2nd Kingdoms would be what we consider 1st and 2nd Samuel. And then in the Hebrew Bible, there was just Kings. And so it's a very long work, obviously. The Septuagint, that was 3rd and 4th Kingdoms, because really 1 Samuel through 2 Kings is all telling one long story. And so that's what we have as 1st and 2nd Kings in our English Bibles. Now, as far as who wrote the book of Kings, 1 Kings and 2 Kings, one of the traditional views that has been held is that perhaps Jeremiah was the writer. Perhaps he was inspired to write these works, and that's possible, but there's a few clues. There's no claim throughout 1 Kings or 2 Kings specifically about someone who authored or was commanded to write these things down, and so there's no specific individual named. Likely, it was probably multiple authors. Much like when we looked at 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, there was a verse in 2 Samuel that talked about the writings of Samuel and Gad and Nathan, and they probably all wrote, and then that was compiled into what we have as 1 and 2 Samuel. The books of 1 and 2 Kings are probably similar. They're probably written by some of the prophets that worked and lived during the times, and they wrote about these events probably not long after they occurred, and then later they were compiled. And there's some evidence of that. In 1 Kings 8, verse 8, for example, speaking about the temple that King Solomon built, it says that the poles, this is talking about the ark, that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from the outside, and they are there to this day. And so when 1 Kings chapter 8 was written, the temple was still standing. Now later on, we'll read about, by the time we get to the end of 2 Kings, about the destruction of the temple. When Nebuchadnezzar comes and he destroys Jerusalem and he destroys the actual temple. And even before Nebuchadnezzar, there are raids by other groups of people throughout history that end up robbing many of the things from the temple. And yet when 1 Kings 8 was written, apparently it was written not just of what used to be in the temple, but it says these things that Solomon put in are there to this day. And so that must have been written not long after the completion of the temple, not long after Solomon's reign probably. 1 Kings 12 verse 19 is similar. This is speaking about the departure of the northern tribes of Israel, and we'll talk about that a little this evening. But it says, so Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Now that indicates that this section of Kings was written before the conquest, or before Assyria conquered Israel, because Israel is spoken of as being still in existence and still being in rebellion against the house of David. Now, at a certain point, Israel and Judah actually got along, at least for a little while, and they were allies to a degree, even though they were separate kingdoms, and so that was probably written even before that time period. And so it was probably written by multiple prophets over time. Of course, they were inspired, and then they either gathered their writings and built one upon the other, or perhaps later Jeremiah or Ezra or Nehemiah may have compiled these into the books that they became and that we know of. Now, the time frame of what is covered in these books. In 1 Kings, and we're just going to focus on 1 Kings tonight, but 1 Kings covers a little over a century's worth of history. Now, dates are always you can read different commentaries or different encyclopedias and different historians, and they'll put dates here or there. So whenever you see dates on my slides, like that 970 to 853, I'm not dogmatic about that. Please don't take that as just absolute. These are rough dates that I've read in several places and seem to be pretty good dates. 970 BC is roughly the time that Solomon's kingdom began, that Solomon began to reign as a king. And it takes us through the reign of Jehoshaphat in Judah and Ahaziah in Israel, so somewhere in the 850s BC. So in just the book of 1 Kings, we're going to cover 115 to 120 years of history. And then there'll be more history that's covered in the book of 2 Kings. Now, as we talk about 1 Kings, and again tonight, like we've done with the other books, we're just going to provide an overview. Let's look at or consider some of the themes that find themselves in the book of 1 Kings. And one of the themes is the fulfillment of God's promises. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 28, there God gave a long list of blessings and a list of curses. And the blessings He promised to give to the nation, and He promised that He would bless them when they were obedient, and when they obeyed Him and followed His word, and when they were righteous and holy as they were called to be. But He also warned them that if they departed from the law, and if they rebelled against Him, and they acted like the nations around them, and they went off into idolatry and immorality, that they were going to face punishment and judgment and oppression. And we see that throughout the history of Israel. We see there are times when there are good kings and righteous kings, and there are times when they lead the people into holiness and righteousness, times of restoration and reformation, times when they truly stick to the law of God and do their best to do that. And when that happens, God blesses the people. But we see, and unfortunately we see this more we see the people departing from the law, and we see kings that choose political things over spiritual things, and we see departures from God's ways, and ultimately that brings about God's wrath and God's judgment. One of the things that's interesting about the books of Kings, and this is true about Chronicles, but we'll talk about that when we cover the book of Chronicles, but even the books of Kings are much more spiritual than they are historical or they are political. Now, don't take that the wrong way. I'm not saying that they are not historically accurate. I believe the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles are historically accurate, and they are works of history, but they're not your normal works of history. Usually, there's a lot of details that you might find in a normal work of history that you aren't going to find even in the books of Kings. And Chronicles is even more spiritually focused than the books of Kings are. But even the books of Kings, it is a theological history, you might say. It is a religious or a spiritual history. Yes, it's concerned about the years that the kings reigned and how long they reigned and who followed who, but more, the works are worried about or interested in how those kings behaved and how the nation behaved. In fact, one of the ways that we see this is historically, Ahab was not that impressive of a king. Now, his father Omri in the northern nation of Israel, Omri was actually a very significant king historically. In fact, we find more records of him than we do many of these other kings in other sections of secular history that you can find. Omri was a very impressive king, to be honest, from a political standpoint. But the Bible really doesn't say a lot about Omri. It tells about how he came to power, a little bit about his reign, that he wasn't a righteous king, even though he was a pretty successful king. And then it talks about his son Ahab. Now, Ahab fills almost the latter half of the book of Kings, along with the prophet Elijah. The Bible is very focused and interested in Ahab, even though historically he's really not even much of a footnote. The Bible focuses on him a great deal. Why? Because there are some very important spiritual lessons to be learned, from a negative perspective, of course, about Ahab. And so we see a spiritual focus in the books of Kings. Now, we also see throughout these books a slow decline to apostasy. Try and get this moving here. A slow decline to apostasy. When David reigned, remember, David made some mistakes, but David was a righteous man and a righteous king. And under his leadership, the kingdom was presumably quite righteous and obedient as well. Solomon, of course, began, as we're going to see, righteously, and the kingdom thrived under Solomon. But by the end of Solomon's reign, he makes some mistakes that lead to idolatry. And he makes some very poor choices. And then that continues to happen under his son Rehoboam. And we see then after the departure of the 10 northern tribes, the northern nation of Israel continues to go further and further down this path of idolatry. That begins to impact the nation of Judah. And they begin to have more and more problems with idolatry. While they have some kings that try and right the ship, there will be other kings that lead them down this wrong road. And so we see worse and worse idolatry and immorality and sinfulness in God's people. And the books of 1 Kings and then 2 Kings show us that sad and pitiful decline. And then also, on a more positive note, there is the rise and the prominence of the prophets. Now, prophets have been in the Bible up to this point. Moses was a prophet, and obviously he featured highly in the earlier books of the Bible. And then we had Samuel, who we mentioned kind of was brought in the era of the prophets. It's after Samuel that we see prophets continuously, but after Samuel, there's not a real focus. We have Nathan, we have Gad, there's a few other prophets that are mentioned, but they aren't really front and center. They're not really in the spotlight of the biblical story. But once we get to chapter 17 of 1 Kings, Elijah becomes front and center. Now, it kind of focuses about him and Ahab back and forth, but instead of focusing just on a king, Elijah becomes a central focus. And after Elijah, Elisha is going to become a central focus. And from that point on, there are going to be major prophets that are involved. This is when the writing prophets are going to start picking up. And as we get to the latter section of the Old Testament, this is historically where they begin falling in as they start having a much larger role in preaching and warning and in writing the warnings of God. And so this is happening during this era, this time period that we're reading about in the book of 1 Kings. Well, to help us outline the book, I always like to try and look at an outline to understand the big picture of the book. And the book of 1 Kings can be divided into a couple of primary sections. The first 11 chapters are all about Solomon. Kind of like the entire book of 2 Samuel is all about David, Solomon gets a very lengthy treatment. He gets half of the book of 1 Kings. So the first 11 chapters are all about him. We read about his rise to power and how he comes to be the king. We read about his wisdom, and we read about his great accomplishments, his buildings, how wise and revered he was among the world. But then in chapter 11, we read about Solomon's folly, which might sound strange for a wise man, but even though he had possessed great wisdom, he still made some very foolish choices, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a moment. But after we finish up Solomon's reign and life in the first 11 chapters, then we begin the new section and the new part of Israel's history, and that is the divided kingdom. During the reign of Solomon's son Rehoboam, the kingdom splits. The 10 northern tribes set up their own kingdom, and they set up their own king, and they are the kingdom of Israel, sometimes referred to as Ephraim. And then you have Judah, along with the remnant of Benjamin, makes up the southern kingdom of Judah. And of course, that's where the Davidic line continues to reign. We'll look at some of the kings in both here in just a little while. But this section is can be broken up into two times. The first 4 chapters of it, 12 through 16, first 4 or 5, there's enmity. There's constant war and strife between the two nations. From chapter 17 on, when you get to Ahab, that is kind of calmed down, and you actually start seeing Judah and Israel begin working together. In fact, Ahab's war with Syria, he has invited Jehoshaphat and Judah to come help him fight that war. In fact, that battle in which Ahab dies, Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, is actually engaged in that same battle. And so you have a time period where they're at enmity during the rebellion, then you have a time where they finally kind of accept the separation, and there is some peace, at least for a while. So let's just go through these. Again, we're not going to be able to focus on any of these stories real in depth, but hopefully just this overview will encourage you, if you want to go do some more study in the book of 1 Kings, that you'll be equipped to do so. So the first couple chapters tell us about the very end of David's reign. David's a very elderly man. At the beginning of this book, he knows his time is coming to an end, but as he is very close to death's door, as happens in kingdom sometime, and has happened historically, there is a shakeup in the kingdom because different sons want the power. Now, David had apparently already promised Bathsheba and knew that Solomon was supposed to be the next king. But his son Adonijah decides that he is going to be the next king, and he has some supporters. Joab supports him. One of the priests support him. And so Adonijah actually gathers quite a following. And it may have seemed very logical for Adonijah to be the king. He was David's fourth born. Now, we know at least 2 of his older brothers were dead. Amnon was the firstborn. If you remember, he's the one who raped his half-sister Tamar, and for that ended up being murdered in revenge by Absalom. And so David's eldest son was dead. Then during the rebellion, Absalom, of course, was killed by Joab, and so Absalom is dead. There is the second-born son of David, I believe his name was Chileab, but other than when he's mentioned in the lists of sons that are born to David, there's nothing else ever mentioned about him. And so some commentators believe that maybe he had died from disease or in a battle or for some other reason. We don't know why he's not mentioned. We don't know for sure that he's dead, but it seems very likely. And so if that's true, then Adonijah, who was David's fourth born, would have been the eldest living, perhaps. And so it would have maybe seemed natural to Adonijah, and maybe Joab and these others, that he should be the one that takes the throne. And so he presumes that he gets to be king, and he sets himself up as king. But Bathsheba speaks with David. and I believe it's also Nathan the prophet helps her. And David declares that it is Solomon who is going to be king. Adonijah ends up relinquishing the crown, and he is spared. His life is spared by Solomon, and so Solomon becomes the king. Now, in chapter 3, we read about that scene that is one of the famous scenes of the Bible when Solomon requests wisdom. And this is kind of a lengthy reading, but I want to go ahead and read this passage. If you want to follow along in your own Bible, or you can follow along on the screen. In 1 Kings chapter 3, we're told that Solomon has come up to Gibeon. There's a high place on Gibeon where he has come to make sacrifices. The temple has not been built yet. And so it says beginning in verse 3, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I shall give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne to this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern this, your great people?" It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this, and God said to him, "Because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life, or riches, or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall rise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days." This is an incredible scene. God appears to Solomon. He's a very young man at this point. That doesn't mean that he was foolish. I think that Solomon was already a wise man. The fact that he knew to ask for wisdom showed that he had an element of wisdom already. David had taught him. He had learned. But God comes to Solomon and says, "What would you like?" Now that's a pretty amazing thing. Imagine that you were given that opportunity by God to ask for whatever you wanted, whatever you thought would make you the most successful in this life. What would you ask for? I know that it's tempting for us to say we'd answer like Solomon would, and we'd be humble and we'd be pious and we'd say something like this. But would we really? Or would we ask for the long life, for riches, for power, for fame? What would we ask for? Well, Solomon had that opportunity. Now, I don't know exactly what would have happened if he asked for long life. Maybe God would have said, "Well, you can have that, but that's all you'll have. You won't have the riches or the other things." We don't know. But Solomon realized that he was in a position of power. At this time in his life, he truly loved the Lord. He had learned that from his father. And that love had become his own love. And he wanted to please the Lord. And he wanted to serve God's people. And so he recognized that his greatest need was the ability to discern what's right. The ability to know and to possess wisdom so that he could make good choices when it came to leading God's people. And that was a wonderful thing to ask for. In fact, it says it pleased the Lord that Solomon asked this. That's an interesting thought. You know, when you think about your own prayers, when I think about my prayers, is God pleased with what we pray for? You think God is pleased with the things you ask for, the requests that you make? It's kind of a sobering question. But God grants this. He tells him that he will give him a discerning mind. Also, as a reward, he says, because you've asked this, I'm going to grant you some of these other things you could have asked for. He says you'll have riches, you'll have long life. But notice that there is also a condition. God says, if you will walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. God gave Solomon a great gift. in some way, in some manner that I don't exactly know how, but in some way God granted Solomon great discernment, great wisdom, more than he could have just learned on his own. Somehow God opened up his mind to be able to know and to discern in a great capacity, beyond what any had done before and any would do after. But God only gave him the ability to discern right from wrong. It was still going to be up to Solomon to choose between right and wrong. And as we're going to see, Solomon possessed great wisdom, but that didn't mean he always made wise choices. So we read about Solomon's reign after this. There's the examples of Solomon's wisdom and success, the famous story of the two women that come before him, and there's only one child, both claiming it's their child, and he says to bring a sword and cleave the child in two and give half to each. Of course, one woman says that sounds good to her. The other begs that the child just be given to the other woman, and thereby he deduces who the real mother is. That's just one example. Surely there were many, many stories that could have been recorded for us of Solomon's wisdom, but we're given that example. We're told about his various success. And then, in really one of the largest sections of 1 Kings, chapters 5 through 9 are devoted to Solomon's preparations and the building of the temple. Now, of all the things that Solomon did, and it tells us about a lot of his wealth and tells us about his palace and some of the other things, but the largest section that's recorded of Solomon's life in these historical sections are about the building of the temple, about his dedication to building the temple where God would be worshipped. God had chosen Jerusalem. This is where the Ark of the Covenant had come. David had brought it to Jerusalem. David wanted to build a temple that was greater than the tabernacle, but he was not allowed. But Solomon would be allowed. And Solomon built the temple. And then in chapter 10, we read about the visit of the Queen of Sheba as she comes, and that just shows us more of his grandness and his greatness. Here's a picture, by the way. Now, this is an artist's rendition. No one knows exactly what the temple would have looked like, but it was probably one of the most magnificent buildings that have ever been erected. It was surely beautiful, the amount of gold that went into it. If you can tell there in that picture, the inner part of the temple and the holy place and the most holy place were pretty much entirely overlaid in gold. They were made of ornate woodworkings and then overlaid with gold. You can just imagine if you walked in and the menorahs were burning at full flame at certain points, how beautiful it must have been to just be surrounded with this vision. And there were palm trees and pomegranates that were carved in and overlaid with gold, and it would have been like a golden paradise, is what it would have looked like on the inside. By the way, there's some allusions back to the garden there, by the way. I'll leave that for you to study further if you're interested. But it must have been a beautiful and an incredible building. Everything about it was just magnificent, grandiose, and incredible. But really, the greatness was not in the materials. The greatness was in chapter 9, after Solomon dedicates the temple and gives his speech, and the glory of God, the presence of God, fills the temple. And that's what really made it a great place. God was dwelling in the midst of his people, just as he wanted to, and just as he desired for his people to have him there with them. But unfortunately, there's chapter 11. Kind of like with David's reign, we read about a lot of David's success, and then there's the but. Now, David recovered from his. We hope that Solomon recovered from his. But in 1 Kings 11, we read about some foolish choices. We won't read too many verses, but it says in verse 1, King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Zidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. So Solomon begins amassing wives, and that may sound really strange. Why would this man have 700 wives and 300 concubines? Now, maybe he just liked to add wives, but I think what a lot of this is Solomon is increasing his kingdom's power. And a lot of these are probably diplomatic marriages. And he is adding wives, and when he marries Pharaoh's daughter, that creates a natural alliance with Egypt. And as he marries the daughters of Moabites and Ammonite and Edomite kings, he's basically bringing these wives in. They may not function like an ambassador does today, but they made for peaceful relations. And given Solomon's power and the growth of his kingdom, he probably gets to negotiate from greater stances here. And so he's building his kingdom's power and influence and wealth. But there's a problem with that. Now, it's a genius idea for building a kingdom. It's a terrible idea for spiritual faithfulness. This helped Solomon make even more money and become even more powerful. But what came along with all of these marriages and these women that he brought into his life was exactly what God had said. And you don't need supernatural wisdom. You don't need a special gift from God to know what the outcome of this story is going to be, because God had already given this bit of wisdom to everybody who would listen to the law. He said, if you intermarry with these nations, they will turn your hearts from me. Everybody could know that. Solomon should have certainly known it. But he chose to pursue this avenue anyways. There's an important lesson here. You can have all the knowledge in the world. You can have all the wisdom in the world. Knowledge is important. We should not seek to be ignorant. Wisdom is important. We should chase after and pursue wisdom. But none of that matters if we won't choose what's right. If you can answer the most difficult ethical questions because of your wisdom and powers of discernment, but you don't make the right ethical choices, it doesn't matter. Solomon was incredibly wise, but in the end he made some foolish choices. And because of this, God told Solomon that the kingdom was going to be torn away. And that's exactly what happened. During the reign of his son Rehoboam, his son makes some very foolish choices. When he becomes king, the nation comes and they say, look, your dad's projects were wonderful and all, but they taxed us beyond measure. We've had enough of that. We need some alleviation. And so he talks with the council that his father had, men that had worked with the wisest man that ever lived. These are counselors that should have some wisdom. And they say, listen to the people. Alleviate their burden, and they will be fiercely loyal to you. And he says, okay, I'll think about that. And then he goes and he talks to his friends and his peers, people that don't have any experience. And they say, you go back to them and you tell them if they thought they had it bad under Solomon, they just better get ready because it's going to be a lot worse. You're stronger, you're more powerful, you crush these people's will. He likes the sound of that. That sounds a lot better. That sounds powerful. And so that's what he does when the people come back and they say, what do we have to do with the house of Jesse? And 10 tribes say, we're done. And they go off and they make a man named Jeroboam their king. Now, I love to talk about Jeroboam. It's a heartbreaking story, but it's so many good applications, but I can't get off on that sidetrack. But Jeroboam was basically given an opportunity like David. God had told Jeroboam that if he would walk before him and be blameless, that he would establish him. Now, he wasn't going to take away David's line, but he would establish Jeroboam. But unfortunately, once the kingdoms separate, and you can kind of see a map here of Judah was, of course, a very large territory, so it's still almost as big as the rest of Israel combined. But after they separate, Jeroboam starts getting worried. What about, you see, these people are supposed to keep going back down to Jerusalem, and there's that magnificent temple down there that Solomon built. And the people might be mad, for right now, but if they keep going back to Jerusalem year after year, as the law tells them to do, at some point they're going to say, why are we doing this? Why are we a different country? Let's just get back together. Jeroboam doesn't want that. And so Jeroboam sets up golden calves, one down here in Bethel, the very southern part of Israel, one up at Dan, the very northern part of Israel. And he sets up his own religion, and he mimics it after certain aspects of the Mosaic law, but he makes a religion of his own choosing, of his own devising. And that way the people won't go back and forth. And this ends up being one of the most devastating choices in history. Because from this point forward, Israel is going to follow a path of idolatry. And it's going to ruin the people. And so from this point forward, the book of 1 Kings tells us about these kings. It tells us about the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah. Here's something that just you'll see. It kind of helps you understand. You've probably recognized this before. You may not have called it this. That's the fancy name for it, the regnal formula. But the Bible tells us about each king in turn. They tell us just some basic information, maybe how old they were when they started to reign and how long they reigned. It will give an evaluation of whether they were good or whether they were bad. It will reference other works that some of their deeds have been recorded in. And then it will talk about their death, their burial, and their successor. Now, some kings have pretty lengthy passages written about them. Again, King Ahab. Later on, King Hezekiah in the book of 2 Kings. Some kings, we don't know much more than just these very basic statements. Again, the writer of Kings is not really interested in all the historical details that we might be intrigued by, but is really just showing, highlighting spiritual matters. And so here's the kings that we read about in the book of 1 Kings. We read about 4 kings, and this is, of course, after Solomon in Judah. There's Rehoboam, then Abijah, then Asa, and Jehoshaphat. Now, I don't know if you can tell very well, but Asa and Jehoshaphat are bolded here. That indicates those were the 2 righteous kings. Rehoboam and Abijah were both wicked kings. They did not follow after David, but Asa reformed things and turned things around, and his son Jehoshaphat was a righteous king. You'll notice over in Israel that not a single one of those names is highlighted or bolded. And that's because not a single one of those men were righteous men. Not a single one of those men turned to God. Now, some of these men were blessed by God and given opportunities by God, but every single one of them would then turn their back on God and go down the road of immorality. And usually they compounded and compounded. Also, you see the chaos of the kingdom. These little asterisks that are here, this marks a change in royal family. So Nadab was Jeroboam, the first son. But Jeroboam's line didn't last long. Remember why he set up those false images? Because he was worried about losing the kingdom. You know what happened? His family lost the kingdom. His family would have kept the kingdom if he would have obeyed God. Instead, after his son, the line's lost. His son's assassinated, and Baasha becomes king. His son reigns, but then a man named Zimri assassinates him, and he reigns for an entire week before Omri, another commander of the army, comes, and he kills Zimri, and he takes over. And he actually establishes a line for a little while, but it won't last. And so Israel just goes from royal family to royal family. That's one thing about Judah. According to God's promise, it always stayed in the line of David. But at this point, as I've already kind of mentioned, we have a shift in focus, and it's not just about the kings, but Elijah comes on the scene in chapter 17. And there's so many wonderful stories about Elijah. We can't talk about these in detail. But Elijah comes to the forefront during Ahab's reign. And we'll talk about Ahab in just a moment. But as Ahab and Jezebel are leading the nation to depths of depravity and idolatry that had not even been thought of before, Elijah comes on the scene. And his predominant focus is on Ahab. He speaks with Ahab mainly and mostly. The story begins in chapter 17 where Elijah prophesies about. The New Testament tells us he prayed about this, requesting this, a drought that ended up lasting for 3.5 years. Now, during this time, there's a story of Elijah and this widow of Zarephath. He even raises her son, and so a powerful miracle. But then chapter 18, perhaps the most well-known part of Elijah's story, he comes and he challenges Ahab, and he challenges the priests of Baal. They meet on Mount Carmel. And they agree that what they'll do is they'll each build an altar and place a bull on it, and they'll pray to their gods. And whoever's God burns that sacrifice, that's the one true God. And of course, he gives them hours and hours as they cry out to Baal all morning and in the afternoon, and they cut themselves and make fools of themselves, and nothing happens. And then Elijah, of course, he digs a trench around his altar, and he has it filled up with water, and he pours water all over the bull and all over the water. and then he prays to God. And I don't know exactly what it looked like. I don't know if it looked anything like this artist rendition or not, but it's one of the scenes I've always thought would be neat to see. Somehow fire came down from heaven, and it licked up that entire sacrifice and that altar and all that water, and it was abundantly clear who the one true God was. It was the God of Israel. It was the God of Elijah. It was the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Baal was false and just a figment of man's imagination. Well, that incredible victory, you'd think, would have maybe turned the tide, but it didn't really. Jezebel, Ahab's wife, was furious and decided she was going to kill Elijah. Even though Elijah had just seen this powerful thing, he fled from Jezebel in chapter 19. And there's some beautiful things in that story. I'll let you read those since we don't have a lot of time. But those are some of the things we read about Elijah. But also we read quite a bit about Ahab. Now listen to this. This is the description of Ahab from the Bible. Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. And Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. That's not the description you want from God. He did more to provoke the Lord to anger than Jeroboam and his father Omri, than all the other bloodthirsty and idolatrous men that came before him. He found new depths of depravity and wickedness. And as we look at his life and what we read about, we see some of his problems. And the first problem was he married a wicked woman. In fact, there's one passage in 1 Kings 21:25 that says that there was none who sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord like Ahab, whom Jezebel, his wife, incited. Now, one of the themes, I think I forgot to list this in the lessons that we'll look at in just a moment, so I'll mention it here. One of the very important lessons of Kings is how important marriage is. Now, I think, maybe I'm giving him too much credit. I think Ahab was responsible for his own choices. There's also a story in Ahab's life when he was rebuked by Elijah and he repented. And it even impressed God. And God said because of his repentance, which was genuine, God was not going to destroy his kingdom during Ahab's days. The man may have had the ability to listen. It's possible. But he married such a wicked woman that he never did. And even during the bright moments where he would tolerate a prophet or he would begin to listen to a prophet, she always ended up turning him away, so that he became one who did more evil in the sight of the Lord than anyone else. Now you couple that with the idea that Solomon made foolish choices, the wisest man in the world, given a special gift of wisdom from God, and he committed idolatry and left the Lord because he was influenced by the women he married. Now, if that's not a warning of the dangers of marrying individuals who are not spiritually minded, who are worldly, who are carnal, and I don't know what stronger warning there could be, especially in a congregation like ours where we have so many young ones. I know it seems like a long ways away. We don't want to think about these little kids dating and getting married. It's not that far down the road. We've got a decade. Less maybe for some of the older ones, a little bit more for some of them. We need to instill right values because marriage is an incredible blessing. Or it can be a terrible tragedy. It was for Ahab, it was for Solomon. Of course, that led him to idolatry. There's the story of Naboth's vineyard. Jezebel plays a key role in that. And then there's the failure to listen to God's prophet Micaiah in chapter 22. Jehoshaphat has joined him. They're going to war with Syria. Jehoshaphat wants to hear from a prophet. They've heard from hundreds of prophets that said, yes, go up, you'll defeat Syria. Jehoshaphat wants to hear from a prophet of the Lord. And so they call Micaiah. Now Ahab hates this man. Micaiah goes up, and at first he says, yes, go up and fight the Syrians. And he was obviously sarcastic, as Ahab says, how many times do I have to tell you to just tell me the truth? And he says, if you go up to this battle, you're not coming back. Well, Ahab didn't like that, so he locks him up and tells him basically he's supposed to be locked up with bread and water until he comes back from the field of battle. The man says, if you come back from that field of battle, then I'm not a prophet of God. He turned out to be a prophet of God. Now, Ahab tried to trick the Lord. He disguised himself as just an ordinary soldier. He has Jehoshaphat go ahead and dress up like a king. Well, the Syrian commander has a special group of men that he says, you don't do anything. You don't fight anybody except Ahab. You go kill that man. Well, they thought Jehoshaphat was King Ahab, and so they were tricked for a while, and then they realized it wasn't him. They have no idea where Ahab is. It looks like he may get away with it. The Bible says that there's an archer for the Syrians that just at random pulls back his bow. He's not really aiming at anyone in particular. He's just hoping to hit something out there in this great melee of soldiers. And he pulls that bow back and he lets that arrow fly, and it finds a chink in Ahab's armor. And Ahab makes it to his chariot and gets out of the field of battle, and he bleeds out in that chariot and he dies because he wouldn't listen to God. And that's where the book of 1 Kings ends. The last little paragraph is about his son that takes over, and then we'll pick up with his story more when we get to 2 Kings. But very quickly, a few lessons from the book of Kings. And we've talked about these, so we won't dwell on them too long. But again, the importance and yet the limitations of wisdom. Don't take what I've said tonight the wrong way. Wisdom is important. Solomon asked for the right thing. It's more important than riches. It's more important than popularity. It's more important than stuff and pleasure and all the things of this world. Wisdom is important. That's why there's a whole section of the Old Testament that is wisdom literature. Pursue wisdom. But always recognize the limitations of wisdom. And that is that wisdom is always going to be limited by our choices. It's not enough to possess wisdom. It's not enough to possess knowledge. Even the wisest person can be led astray when they're led by their desires instead of their wisdom. Also, the danger of idolatry and rebellion. Again, the author of Kings focuses on the spiritual relationship between the kings and God much more than any political factors. The sad part is the kings didn't do that. The kings tended to focus on political and carnal matters, not their relationship with God and spiritual issues. And that brought about idolatry, and it brought about rebellion, and it brought about pain, and it brought about suffering. Also a lesson, we haven't talked too much about this, but the idea of faithfulness at any cost. The stories of Elijah and Naboth are good stories. Elijah was a powerful prophet, but he didn't have it easy. He didn't just get to go around preaching and enjoy a good reputation. His life was often threatened. He had to go and he had to run and he had to hide, but he stuck with it. Even when he got discouraged and depressed. When he finally listened to God, he would go back to his work of warning and encouraging. But also the story of Naboth, we didn't get to talk about that much. You know the story. Ahab came and tried to buy Naboth's vineyard, and Naboth wouldn't sell it. We might think that sounds silly. Why wouldn't the man sell the vineyard? It was a matter of law. That was his inheritance. This reminds us that even in northern Israel, there were people that were trying to live right. Naboth was one of those men. You see, in the law of Moses, if a person became poor or distraught, they could let out or sell their land to help them for a bit. But then when the year of Jubilee came around, that land was to be given back to them. The purpose of the law, the goal of the law was you got your inheritance and it stayed in your family. You didn't just sell it to make a profit. And so when Ahab comes and he says, I'll make you a big fat offer, I like that vineyard, Naboth says, I can't do that. And he lost his life for it. We might think that's a silly thing to lose your life for, a silly little vineyard. It wasn't a silly little vineyard. It was his inheritance, and he was obeying the law of Moses, and he died for it. But I'd rather die for obeying the law like Naboth than die trying to trick the Lord like Ahab. We see some great lessons, even though we see some great rebellion throughout the books of Kings. There are also some examples of faithfulness that we should learn from. But lastly, one of the lessons that we learn, and I like to point this out, I hope to point things like this out so that we can see how this connects to the greater story of the Bible. This book of Kings, and 2 Kings will do the same thing, really demonstrates the great need for a truly righteous king. Remember, Israel is at this point already waiting for a Messiah. They're waiting for the king. And it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And with every king, even the ones that become righteous, Jehoshaphat makes some foolish choices. Hezekiah is a great king. He makes some bad choices. David was a wonderful king, made some very bad choices. And we keep seeing again and again and again the inadequacy of men to deliver God's people. And so it points forward all these men who wear the crown for a while. It builds the anticipation for when the one true king is going to come. Of course, we know the story of the New Testament, how different he looked in so many ways from these men, and how thankful we should be for that. How thankful we should be that we serve a king like Jesus, not a king like Ahab, not a king like the kings of this world, not even a good king like David or Hezekiah or Jehoshaphat. We get to bow the knee to the King of Kings, the perfect and righteous King, the King that died for us and has offered us redemption and salvation and eternal life. That's something, as great as Solomon built his kingdom, he couldn't offer his people forgiveness. He couldn't offer them eternal life. Jesus can, and Jesus does. And so while we learn about the kings of old, hopefully it draws our eyes even closer to the greatness of Jesus, the one true King. I hope that that's helped maybe give you some ideas about studying the book of 1 Kings. I hope that's been somewhat interesting this evening. But as we draw that study to a close, we have an opportunity to extend the gospel. Perhaps there's someone here who would like to obey the gospel. And if you believe in Jesus and are ready to repent of your sins and confess Him as the Son of God, and it's time for you to be baptized for the remission of your sins. Or if you're a Christian and you desire the prayers of the church, we'd be happy to pray with you and for you. And so we'd invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.